Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another virtual lecture. My name is Susan Bowden, and I'm the Digital Outreach Coordinator for the Archaeological Conservancy, and I'm really pleased that you're all here tonight. If you're joining as a Conservancy member, we want to thank you. Your support makes our work possible. If you're joining as someone new to the Conservancy, let me tell you a little bit about us. We're the only national nonprofit organization that identifies, acquires, and preserves the most significant archaeological sites in the United States. We've been doing this work about 44 years, and in that time, we've preserved almost 600 sites across the nation, and they represent a broad spectrum of time periods and cultures. 6 months ago, we launched a brand new website. If you haven't seen it, please go take a look. I'll be dropping the link to you so that you can do that. We have a beautiful place on the website that talks about our magazine, and the new September fall edition or issue is out now. And so if you haven't seen that, you'll want to go read those excerpts. There's also an interactive map where you can learn about some of our preserves and other virtual and in-person events that we sponsor. Before we start tonight's lecture, I wanted to give you a little bit of information about problem solving. We'll have a time at the very end of the presentation for you to ask questions, and we really do want to hear from you. So you'll want to look down towards the bottom of your Zoom window. There is a Q&A section. Please put your questions in there. You can drop those in at any time throughout the presentation, and I'll be moderating the Q&A section with Dr. Engelbrecht at that time. Technical difficulties, your best bet at this point is to go over and watch our live stream on Facebook, or you can always go back and rewatch the recording on YouTube. It should be posted for you sometime toward the end of tomorrow. I will be sending an email out to you about that, and it will include some other related resources for you to use also. So with that, I am going to stop my screen share and hand things over to Kelly Berliner. She is our Eastern Regional Director, and she has agreed to introduce our speaker for tonight. So Kelly, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. As Susan shared, I'm in the Eastern region for the Archaeological Conservancy, so that covers Maine down through North Carolina. And I'm really excited tonight to have Dr. William Engelbrecht, Bill Engelbrecht, joining us to talk about his work on a site that is now an Archaeological Conservancy preserve. So it's always really special for me to get lectures that pertain to some of the sites we've been able to help protect. A little bit of background on Bill. He's been a longtime friend of the Conservancy. He's a major contributor to the field of Northeastern archaeology. He got his doctorate from the University of Michigan in 1971, and from there went on to teach at Buffalo State College, which you now know as Buffalo State University, where he led 17 archaeological field schools, and these were out at the Eaton site, which he'll be discussing tonight. It's located in West Seneca, New York, so very close to Buffalo. He's published extensively on his research in New York on Haudenosaunee or Six Nation sites, with some of the focuses being on ceramics, population demographics, lithic tools, and so on. With all of his tremendous work and contributions, he was given the Lifetime Achievement Award last year by the New York Archaeological Council to recognize all those wonderful contributions to the discipline. Additionally, beyond his own research, Bill really understands the importance of cultivating new archaeologists in the field. He's been a professor, he was a professor at Buffalo State for many years and earned the Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Teaching in 1990. And I've had the honor of working with many archaeologists who were students of Bill's, or he served as their advisor, and they're now out in the field and they're working with the Conservancy on different projects. So it's always really fun to see that connection or discover that connection. Additionally, in 2009, he established the Summer Fieldwork Anthropology Scholarship Fund that helps a deserving student participate in a field school. And I think that's just, I didn't know that about Bill, so I did a little bit of sleuthing online. And that's just such a wonderful thing to help ensure that archaeology remains accessible and that field schools remain accessible for students. So just absolutely wonderful. As far as the Conservancy goes, Bill was really instrumental in bringing the Eaton site to our attention. This was back in the early 2000s. With his assistance and his support and encouragement, we acquired a portion of that site, so about 9.5 acres in 2005. He further has assisted us with all sorts of things in New York in terms of background on sites, helping us on our Iroquoian tour that we ran, and generally just being an excellent lifetime member of the Conservancy and a huge supporter of our work. Recently, he's reached out to the Eastern office, reached out to me about doing some habitat restoration at the Eaton site that he'll talk a little bit about tonight. And it's a really new project. I'm really excited about it. And so I just am so grateful for his continued interest. So even though Bill officially retired in 2003, I'm not sure archaeologists ever really retired from the research and the work that they do. So he's continued to analyze lithics from excavations at Eaton, and he's going to get into that work a bit more tonight. So thank you so much, Bill. It means so much to me and to the Conservancy to have you join us for this, and I will hand it over to you at this point.
Well, thank you. I appreciate great. You did your homework, and so you can see my PowerPoint. Let me enlarge. Shall I enlarge it?
Nope, you look great, Bill.
Okay, there. And well, Kelly already gave you the. Oops, Kelly gave you the background information. It's near Buffalo, and it was purchased in, I think, 2005 by the Conservancy. Now, yeah, I was really privileged to run 17 summer field schools on the site. Many were for Buff State, few were for SUNY Buffalo, and some were actually joint field schools by both institutions. And because I also had an adjunct appointment at SUNY Buffalo. So here's can you see the whole picture of the site? Shall I move it over?
It's perfect, Bill. We can see it exactly the way it should look. You're doing
Okay,
great.
good. Okay. It was mapped in 1954 by Marion White as a 2-acre knoll. But unfortunately, in the 60s, there was a gravel operation. There was construction, which destroyed a portion of the site. And it's really a pocket of forest surrounded by urban development. And one reason that I chose the site initially was that I was concerned that it might be obliterated. This, of course, in 1975, before we had federal legislation protecting a lot of sites like this, before the Conservancy. And so I thought, well, this would be a good choice for a field school. It's near Cazenovia Creek, which is a tributary of the Buffalo River, which then flows into Lake Erie. So this is a way back time machine, 1975. I'm the shaggy guy holding the sign, and the gentleman to my left, Jay Cohen, went on to do cultural resource management in the New York City area. And here's I'm not going to show you all 17 seasons, but I have group shots, 17 group shots. This is from a joint UB Buff State field school. I'm seated in the front row center, and the guy on the far right is Dr. Scott Stull, who's teaching at Cortland and Ithaca College. The guy in the middle row on the far left, Tim Barker, who's doing CRM in New England. And yeah, just about every field school I taught, there were one or two students that did go on in archaeology, which I'm pleased about because they actually made a living. Now, there are two individuals that I want to acknowledge in this talk. The first, Professor Marion White, who was at SUNY Buffalo, and she hired me my first archaeology job back in 1968 when I was still a graduate student. And I was doing my dissertation on Iroquois pottery. And so coming to Buffalo, working here enabled me to look at ceramic collections here and across the state. And I learned a great deal from her. She was really a great mentor. The gentleman, Jack Holland, a navigational archaeologist, lived near the site, but in his retirement, he took up lithic analysis and really became very proficient at it. He won the Crabtree Award from the SAA for lithic analysis. And when I retired and started working with lithics, about every 2 weeks, I'd take a box of stone tools and I'd go over to Jack's lab at the Museum of Science, and we would go over each one and argue about it. And I really learned a lot from Jack also, especially the use life of tools. Well, here's an excavation shot. The white stakes mark post moles, which are remains of decayed posts marking the wall of a longhouse. Here we are inside a longhouse. You can't really see anything here. You can see Rod Salisbury's back in the foreground. He's now Dr. Salisbury teaching archaeology at the University of Bratislava. So I say if you start digging in West Seneca, you can really go far. Here's a pit in which we found a stone axe or celt. And I had read that in the Jesuit relations, when they were proselytizing among the Huron-Wendat, that people often dug small pits under the bunk line and put valuables there. And we found this pit with a celt exactly under a bunk line. Here's a shot of post moles that mark the northern palisade. There were actually 5 rows. Whether all 5 rows were functional is an open question. I rather think that as the first posts lost some of their structural integrity, perhaps a new line was added. So here we have the grid. We, over 17 seasons, excavated 257 2-meter by 2-meter excavation units. The dotted area there to the right of that is was all gravel operations. So that, unfortunately, that part of the site was destroyed. Colleagues kind of rolled their eyes, or at least in the 70s, said, why wasn't I just bulldozing this and getting the settlement pattern? You can see I've outlined 3 longhouses here and the palisade, but I figured this was a teaching effort, and I wanted students to recover artifacts. So we carefully sifted all of the plow zone and found a lot of material. This was in a pit. It was identified as moose antler. I think it was probably a moose antler hull. It's a very unusual artifact. Was stabilized by the Art Conservation Department at Buff State, and I think it was probably hafted or attached to a handle to use for digging. Some people suggested maybe it was used for softening hides, but I think the hafting suggests it was more of a digging tool. Here's a grinding stone or matade from inside a longhouse. Typically, we think of Iroquoians as using wooden mortar and pestles for grinding grain, but they may occasionally have used stone slabs like this, or this may have been used for nuts or some other purpose. Now, the bulk of this talk is going to be on points, and we have a lot of points from, these are arrow points, unnotched triangular arrow points. As you can see, we recovered 516 whole points, a whole bunch of fragments, and I'll talk about the refits later. So if we take the 1,485 fragments as proxies for the whole, and we also add in the pieces that I refit, we have over 2,000 points. And I figure that in the 17 seasons of excavation, we excavated about 12% of the site. So if we assume a comparable density on the rest of the site, that would give us over 17,000 points. And so the obvious question is, why? Why are there so many points? And if you look in the literature, it says, well, people lose points. Well, they didn't lose over 17,000 points. I'm sorry. I should point out, too, that this site has been collected on since the middle of the 19th century. And when Buffalo held its Pan American Exposition in 1901, when McKinley was shot, there was material from Eaton, lithic material on display. And the take at that time was the site was so picked over that really wasn't worth collecting on anymore. So I think this 17,000 number is actually a very conservative estimate. So, but if they didn't lose all these points, how do we explain them? Well, one possibility is that they were shot into the village in an attack. And again, the Jesuits up in Wendake or Huronia said during an Iroquois attack that the arrows fell like hail. But I think there are problems with this interpretation. First off, I didn't see any exotic lithic material in all of these points and point fragments. It's all local material. But I think more to the point, a lot of points were inside longhouses, were in middens or pits. And if they're being shot into a village, how come they're inside longhouse or bottom of a pit? This particular pit, which also yielded that moose antler hoe I showed you earlier, had all these fragments and 31 whole points. So I don't think it was because of an enemy attack. Now, some people suggested maybe they were stockpiling points in the event of an attack, but they're very widely scattered. And if you look closely at the points, a lot of them have minor dings in them. The very tip may be damaged. And I noticed a striking pattern that one of the basal ears on 29% of the whole points had damaged basal ears. And so in the slide you see, I've oriented the points so that the damaged portion is on the lower left corner. But this kind of damage was consistent for the refits and also for the point bases. Now, what's going on? I think that for reading about shooting deer, and I'm not a hunter, but I started looking at bow hunting magazine, and the best shot is going to go through the ribs into the thoracic cavity, where it will cause massive bleeding. And but the point is to get through the thoracic cavity. And deer ribs are between 2.5 and 5 centimeters apart, depending on the age and the sex of the deer. But the narrower the point, probably the easier it would pass through the rib cage. But it also has to be wide enough so that the arrow shaft will also travel into the target and not stop when it hits its flesh. So you have sort of a it can't be, you have to have the Goldilocks width, I think, not too narrow and not too wide. But I think the damage that we see on about a third of the points comes from grazing the ribs and then breaking off. Now, the standard view of how we attached or hafted these points was that the sinew or ligature went over the edge of the point to secure it in place. But I think there's a problem with that view because you're then the point doesn't have the cutting efficiency that it would without the sinew. It could interfere with penetration of the point into the target. And so some cultures have two different kinds of arrow points. They have arrow points for hunting, and then they have arrow points for warfare. And generally, the points for warfare are hafted the way they're shown on the right, where they will sometimes detach within the target, whether it be a human or an animal. And so I should also note that experimental archaeology suggests that it takes more time to make an arrow shaft than it does to make an arrow. And so if the point were detachable from the shaft, the hunter could then retrieve the shaft, put a new point on. And Dennis Stanford and others have talked about this for earlier cultures. Now, one thing that I learned is that in Eastern North America, arrow shafts were really long. And this is a somewhat stylized depiction of the Powhatan chief and John Smith, but check out the length of the arrow that the chief is holding. It's enormous, and so if that were to penetrate a deer and detach, seems likely to me that its weight and the movement of the target and passing by a brush, trees, other vegetation would loosen the shaft from the point. So if that in fact is the case, what we're left with are carcasses with a lot of arrow points in them, and some broken, some whole. And again, looking at the ethnohistoric literature, there was a Jesuit among the Oneida, 1668, said, "The women do hardly anything else all winter but go and get the flesh of the deer or the moose that the men have killed." And Mary Jemison, who was a Seneca captive and then became a Seneca, said, "In season of hunting, it was our business, in addition to cooking, to bring home the game. It was taken by the Indians, dress it, and carefully preserve the edible meat." So I think you have deer with points and point fragments being brought back to the village. And then I should also note that Dutchman Van den Bogart in 1635 visited Mohawk longhouses, observed all the quarters of venison, and probably hanging from the rafters where it was smoky would also help to preserve it. And women or whoever in butchering and cooking would then come onto the point fragments and probably discard them. And may also, I think, have used them occasionally as expedient tools. I've seen some evidence of that. Now, I'm not done with points. I think I've explained why there are so many points. I think that they're coming back with the game. But I thought, well, again, Rod Salisbury, the gentleman I referred to earlier, when he was a senior, he did his honors thesis. It was involved in trying to refit points, and he got some interesting refits. And so I thought this is worth pursuing. So being retired, having a lot of time on my hands, no deadline, I spread out all the point tips, and then I took out all the midsections, tried to match up each midsection with every tip, and then I got out all the bases, tried to match them up with the midsections, and then the tips. And I think I was reasonably successful. We got 114 men. Some of those were Rod Salisbury's, but the vast majority were mine. And we matched 102 bases with tips, and made my day. I got a triple, a point tip, a midsection, and a base. They were all in a longhouse, but they weren't right next to one another. Each one was about 10, 15 feet away from the other, but they were all in the same longhouse. So here's the most interesting pattern, and Salisbury had found one of these patterns, one of these examples, inter longhouse refits. So what I mean by that is a tip that was found in one longhouse fit with a base that was found in another longhouse. And if you look at the average distance over which these refits occurred, they're over 47 meters. And so that's a long way. I don't think you can explain that by plowing or other post-depositional events. Rod and I did a joint paper, and we argued that, in fact, there was meat sharing going on, that you had two chunks of meat, each with a fragment. One chunk of meat went to one longhouse, one went to another. There are other possibilities. If you're a theoretician and you like Chapman's fragmentation and enchainment, you can talk about that. But I think it's just meat sharing. I'm a meat and potatoes kind of guy. But I still wasn't done with points. I get a little obsessive, I guess. And I measured the points that we mended. We didn't physically mend them, but I could put them together for measurement. The points that broke and then we refit were much longer than the whole points. I mean, it was statistically significant. And not only that, but they were thinner. Again, it was statistically significant. So basically, whole points were thicker and shorter than the points that broke, that we mended. Now, I mean, it's kind of obvious, I think, that would be the case, but I don't know. People really haven't considered this. Odell and Cowan in a publication did look at length-width ratios, and they argue that points with lower length-width ratios are more durable, and turned out that was the case with the Eaton points. And Cheshire and Kelly wrote another article looking at thickness-length ratios, and again, the Eaton data supported Cheshire and Kelly's conclusions. And so, I pondered this, and I thought, what this means? This means that if you have a whole point, that's not necessarily reflective of the universe of points of that type. It's probably shorter and thicker than the points that broke. So when you read descriptions of Madison points are on average, so long and so thick. Well, for the ones that made it whole, but not probably for the broken ones. And I also thought, well, while I'm at this, how come Levana points evolved into Madison points? Now, Levana points are earlier triangular unnotched points. They're large, they're thick. Madison points are smaller dimensioned and thinner. And well, we already talked about the fact that points that are narrower more likely to pass through the ribs of a deer or other game animal. And so that clearly is one advantage that Madison points would have over Levana. But I think there was also an advantage in warfare. If you're planning to use a point for warfare, you're just gonna use that point once. You're not gonna probably be able to retrieve it. And so you really don't care, first off, whether it's gonna break or not. But actually, if you hit your target and it fragments or shatters in the target animal or human, it's kind of analogous, not quite as bad, but it's still analogous to a modern expanding bullet, which they do a lot of damage. And John Milner, in an article, reported he went through notes from a surgeon who was attached to the U.S. cavalry in the Plains Wars in the latter part of the 19th century. And the surgeon found it very difficult to extract the shattered projectile points that he encountered in soldiers. And often, if you aren't successful in extracting, it can lead to infection and ultimately a slow and unpleasant death. It's interesting that in the Jesuit relations, they refer to the Erie, and I think Eaton is likely an Erie site. They refer to the Erie as having poisoned arrows. I'm not sure that they had poisoned arrows. There's no corroborating evidence for this, but it's quite possible that if an arrow broke or it couldn't be extracted, it became infected and it acted as if it were a poisoned arrow. Okay, I'm going to change gears now to talk about the present. 2 years ago, I took a colleague out to see the site, and we were on the floodplain of the site, and I thought, boy, the flora here has really changed. There was all this Japanese knotweed, and which I didn't remember, and I remember seeing, I think, Joe Pye weed and jewelweed, and that was all gone. And so I mentioned it to some different people, and they mentioned that there was an organization serving the 8 counties of Western New York called the Partnership for Invasive Species Management. And they worked with nonprofit organizations. So Kelly and I wrote a grant to PRISM for first year a systematic survey of invasive species, because I'm not a botanist. I'm not qualified to tell you whether a plant is invasive or not. And then the second season to work to eradicate invasive species. And anyhow, we submitted the grant and we got it. So here I am with the PRISM crew in the late spring, talking a little bit about the site. They have their computer tablets with enlarged maps of the site. It was gridded out, and they very systematically went over the Conservancy holding and came up with an incredible number of invasive species. I think if you, frankly, you remove all of them, it's not going to be very green there. But ultimately, what I would like to see happen is that the habitat native habitat be restored, and not really just a native habitat, but a habitat as it might have been when there was an Iroquois village there. We know that there was active management of especially the wood's edge and selection not to destroy plants and trees that were beneficial. And so I could see, medicinal plants, pawpaws, other kinds of food plants growing on this area just outside of the village. We don't want to destroy, we don't want to do digging on the site where it hasn't been dug. We don't want to disturb that, but areas of lower archaeological sensitivity. So I talked with Dr. Robert Warren, who's a biologist at Buff State, who manages the greenhouse, and he was very enthusiastic. He said, "Oh, I'll grow whatever native plants you want, and I'd like to involve students." And I went out and spoke with Dr. Albert Fulton, who's a paleoecologist at the University at Buffalo, and his specialty is reconstruction of habitat in New York, and especially effect of native peoples on the forest. And so he was very enthusiastic and offered to help and involve students as well. In addition, I'd like to involve Native community, knowledgeable members of the Native community, and perhaps even down the line partner with some other environmental groups. But we'll see where this goes. And so I want to close this particular discussion with a suggestion. Hope it's not out of line, but I think it'd be really neat if a bunch of people listening to this were to volunteer to try and restore native habitat on conservancy sites where it was appropriate to do so. I think it would clearly it would increase ecological diversity in the area, and I think all in all it would be a beneficial effort. So something to think about. Okay, that's really it. If I've written a number of articles on stuff from Eaton, and I have uploaded these to ResearchGate and Academia EDU, so you can go on that and download or contact me if they're not loaded. And I've also uploaded data from the site to the Digital Archaeological Record. And so there are a lot of tables there of distributions, distribution maps of artifacts, and also some photos. I have all 114 projectile point refits that I photographed and are up on TDAR. And you can't probably read my email very well. I had to transfer PowerPoint from a newer version to my home computer, which has an older version. But my email is engelbwe@gmail.com. So it's engelbwe@gmail.com. So thank you very much.
Bill, thank you so much. You've piqued a lot of
Welcome.
interest and curiosity. I've got some questions for you. Are you ready to entertain some of them?
Sure.
Awesome. Why don't you go ahead and click on stop share? Or maybe I can just do that for you. Oh, perfect. You did it on your own.
I panicked earlier, but I am educable, so.
You're doing better than I am at this point. I love it.
Got
So
it.
I'm going to take questions a little bit out of order. Apologize to the audience, but a couple of them are more basic before we get into more specifics. So the first question and the second question both are looking at, can you give some information about how long the village at the Eaton site was occupied? And is there any information that you have about what it might have been called when it was inhabited?
I'll answer the first part. Well, the guess is about 20 years, but that's ballpark. We really don't know. And the model that we use for a lot of Iroquoian villages is that they occupied a location and then the community moved a few miles and established a new village, probably established the new village before they moved. But so in Western New York, there are a series of sites, and they probably represent successive locations of the same community. Okay, in terms of what they were called, I don't know. There was the site is dated to roughly AD 1550 from radiocarbon dating, although that period of time is apparently difficult because of blips in the radiation curve. But there are three major candidates: the Erie, which were a confederacy; the Neutral, which were a confederacy largely in Ontario; and the Wenrow. And the Wenrow were said to live between the Seneca, which are to the east, and the Neutral, which are to the west. So, and then in the 19th century literature, you see the term Kakwa. And Kakwa apparently is a Seneca term meaning people to the west or people of the sunset. So, but I don't know what they called themselves. And these populations disappeared in the mid-17th century before Europeans visited them, basically. So there were some Europeans among the Neutral, some French, but not in Western New York. So I don't know. I mean, and the names could have changed. You know, there were, I think the whole process of building the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Confederacy up in Wendake, the Huron. This was a gradual process, one of alliances between villages. And so you may have a village calling itself one thing, they have an alliance with another village and they refer to the alliance by a different name. So I really, to be honest, I looked at the issue and said, well, I don't know. And this is not getting me anywhere. So I wish I could answer it, but I can't.
That was some really good information, though. Thank you. Dr. Pratt is asking several different questions. First of all, he said, thank you for your presentation. You mentioned the triangular shaped projectile points, aka arrow points. Is there a way that determines if they were locally quarried, or was there evidence of extensive trade with them coming from somewhere else?
Yeah. Well, the majority of points, like 85% or so, are of Onondaga chert, and the site is right near an outcrop of Onondaga chert. So, I mean, these people are sitting. That's one reason I think there's so much lithic material on the site. After I retired, I spent 3 years going through student debris bags. I should have done this a long time ago, every year, but I got busy with other things. And so I counted up all the pieces of debris, and we 17 field excavations came to something like 385,000 pieces of debris. So there's just a lot of chert around.
Okay.
And
then,
no, as I said, no exotic chert.
all right. And then a follow-up from him or her. What is known about the relationship between the Eaton site and the Tonawanda village, where Handsome Lake started self-help groups for people with alcoholism in 1799 or 1800?
Yeah, well, there was, you see, much later. That was during Buffalo Creek Territory times. And although I think, anyhow, the population that was in Western New York, and including descendants of people from the Eaton site, I think some of those people were incorporated into surrounding groups, including the Seneca. And then once they were dispersed or absorbed, then the Seneca move into the area. And so it's entirely possible that you had descendants of people who lived there 1630s, 40s, coming back 1790 or so. And I think they very well might have carried a memory. When one of the village location that was occupied before Eaton was the Buffum Street site in South Buffalo. And it's interesting that there was an earth ring around the site, and the site dates to probably around AD 1500. But when they established the Buffalo Creek Reservation, they used the area of the earth ring as their cemetery. And so that's not a coincidence that they knew that that was an earth ring, that it was probably a sacred spot to them, and that's where the burials from the 19th century Iroquois occupation occurred. But Handsome Lake is 19th century, and we're talking at Eaton about 16th century.
Thank you very much, Bill. I'm going to give you a chance to catch your breath for a minute because we've got a couple questions that I think are things that Kelly can field. Kelly, we've got some interest in visiting the site. Is the Eaton site visitable? And if so, what's there? What would they find?
They find a lot of invasive species.
I knew this.
So the site it's difficult to access. It's not routinely open to the public. In some cases, we can make exceptions especially for educational groups like school groups or archaeological societies, but there's really nothing to see there when you go out to the property. It's in a really developed area. The village site itself is located up on a higher terrace, and then there's a large floodplain area along the creek that unless I said, here's the site, you would never know it was there. So it's one of those examples of an archaeological conservancy preserve that somewhat blends in with the surroundings, which is helpful for its protection. People, don't necessarily know it's there. But it also means that there's not any sort of interpretation there. There's no signage or anything like that. But I'm always happy to answer questions about the property, or for educational groups, we can see if we can set something up for that.
Thank you. Can you still hear me?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I was getting weird messages on my screen. So another one for you, Kelly. We've got at least one person in here who's interested in helping work on the botanical habitat and the invasive species. Is that something that you think people could contact regional directors about? Is that something that Bill wants to field? How are we going to do that?
Yeah, I think it really depends on a couple of things. Our different regions have experience with doing this on properties very differently. So, for example, in the Midwest, we've partnered with prairie groups to do prairie restoration on various mound sites. And I don't know as much about that because that's not a region I cover, but it's going to be very different across the country because you're dealing with different sites, different species, and different support organizations. So I'll say here in the East, I'm looking at this as a bit of a test subject because we have some interested parties. There's this wonderful support organization that is assisting in the survey and hopefully some of the removal. So if people are in the area, so that's the second part that's challenging, right? The Conservancy has nearly 600 properties all over the place, and whether or not you live near one is a bit of a toss-up. So if people happen to live in the area, or people can reach out to me and I can, share if something's going on there, but it's going to come down to what the type of strategy ultimately is. So at Eaton, we know it's mostly invasive species. So we need to try to figure out, does that mean we're hand pooling, that we're doing spraying, we're in a floodplain, so we don't necessarily want to spray, that's not so pleasant, but we're still kind of figuring that out. So if people are really interested, you're certainly welcome to reach out to me. If you're in the East, in the other regions, you're welcome to reach out to those directors. Just don't be surprised if the answer is like, we don't have a site that's anywhere near you, or we just don't have any projects like that underway. But it's something that we are thinking about. I'm certainly thinking about it. And there's a chance that we could use extra hands, because goodness knows, even just in my garden, it's a battle with invasive species. So I really appreciate the interest. And yeah, maybe this can be something that becomes a model for other properties. We'll have to see how it goes.
Thank you for that. All right, Bill, you're back up on deck. You ready for another one?
Sure.
Okay. So Dean is wanting to know if you ever encountered human remains inside an Eaton longhouse.
That's Dean Snow, just so you know, Bill.
Oh, all right, Dean, yeah.
Dean.
Well, we did, and I am in full compliance with NAGPA. I mean, we wrote a report, and it's been uploaded to TDAR. I don't remember all the particulars. What I actually did do I think the last two times we encountered human remains, and we didn't encounter very many, and they were mostly adjacent to a longhouse rather than inside a longhouse. We just left them in situ. I figured I was still concerned about destruction of the site, and so I thought, well, I can always say, well, we know there are burials on the site, and so you'd better not mess with them. So that was kind of my strategy in the later years, is to just leave the remains as they were. We uncovered them, photographed them, and I had a physical anthropologist come out and take some measurements, and then we covered it back over.
All right, thank you. Len would like to know why the palisade? Who are they warring against? What's the date on the site? Is it pre-contact? Any indication these points were made on site? I think we answered a few of those already. But why the palisade?
Well, the date is around mid-16th century, I believe. Now I have some maize kernels that are waiting for C14 dating, and so that before the early dates were on chunks of wood, and we all know that there are problems, the old wood problem, and so not always accurate. Why are they fighting? Well, a lot of ink has been spilled over that, and the easy answer and the truthful answer is I don't know. I will tell you though that this is me getting to talk about what I want to talk about, not answering your question, but it was a very high ratio of utilized flakes to debris along the palisade. And I thought this was really odd. Why so many utilized flakes in an area that was otherwise pretty much devoid of artifactual material? And here's my theory, that they were using the utilized flakes to process bark. And I think we have palisades in the Northeast all wrong, because the reconstructions that you see, the posts are spaced maybe, a certain number of inches apart, but you can look right in to the village. If you were an enemy, you could look in. Some reconstructions have kind of like a wickerwork weaving of branches, but you can still see in. And you look, I actually went to the human relations area files, and cross-culturally, one of the important functions of barriers is to serve as a visual barrier. And so I think much the way that longhouses were covered in bark, I think that the palisades had bark, but on the inside, so that they were less accessible on the outside. But this would have given people inside a psychological and tactical advantage in that they could, and the enemy outside wouldn't be able to see in. And so almost all the reconstructions of palisades I've seen in the Northeast, you can look right into the village. And in terms of what we know about defense, that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Bill, do you have a population estimate for the village?
I used, well, Dean Snow's on, and I used his figure of whatever it was, 25 square feet per person he got from surveys. And so using that came up with about 400 people.
Okay. Do you know if any of the contemporary indigenous communities, present day federally recognized tribes that acknowledge their heritage to the Eaton site?
Well, you see, if they were Erie, which is as good a guess as any, but even if they were Wenro or neutral, there aren't current any current groups that I'm aware of that claim that they're Wenro, neutral, or Erie. This is not to say that there aren't descendants of people who lived at the inside. I think it's quite likely that there are. They were probably absorbed by other populations. And then the Seneca moved into the area and claimed the area. So the in a sense, I know Kelly went through the Seneca Tribal Preservation Officer about our plans for vegetation reconstruction, and that's the most reasonable alternative, but it's a little bit dicey to trace a direct relationship.
Thank you. All right. David is asking kind of a global question, and Kelly, if you want to try and jump in on this also, I think both of you could speak to it. Do you have any thoughts on how to best deal with a nation and state that prioritizes development over site restoration or land return, especially in circumstances where evidence of site inhabitation exists?
Wow.
Yeah.
So let me
Question, right?
say first,
Go ahead, Phil.
if you can make it heritage tourism, that's important. And I think increasingly, at least in this country, people are attracted to that. So whether that's in this particular case, that's viable or not, I don't know. Kelly, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, not at all. I was going to say, what you want to do is support the Archaeological Conservancy, because we're on the front line trying to get to these places before developers or other entities do. But truly, I mean, that is why we exist. It is hard. I think there are some shifts that are happening. So depending on what type of community you live in, there are municipalities that are increasingly passing local ordinances to protect historic sites, and in some cases, archaeological sites. In recent years, with the land back movement, I have seen some shifts in terms of what regional land trusts prioritize. So there are more groups, in addition to the Archaeological Conservancy, that are looking at the importance of archaeological sites, the importance of these sites to Native communities, and trying to make them part of their preservation strategies. But it is tough because in most places in this country, there are not local ordinances, and unless there is a federal permit involved with development or some sort of trigger for review, there's nothing stopping people from destroying sites. And so I encourage folks to be active on your local level, right? You can make a lot of difference locally in your community, your county, or your state. And then a lot of this is also just education. So it's outreach, it's education, it's making people aware of these, we call them resources, but we have to keep in mind that for many communities, they're their heritage, right? Their heritage, they're spiritual, they're significant. And so just bringing people into those folds and helping them understand why this matters is a really big part of this challenge as well. So it's a lot of work to do on a lot of different fronts, but it's important stuff. And having people come to these lectures, this is part of our educational effort, right? Making people aware that these are places that are just outside of Buffalo, they're in your backyard, and having more voices is helpful. So.
Thank you both. We've reached our 6 o'clock time frame.
Oh, can I ask real quick, Susan? I wanted to ask if you would entertain Griffin Hamill's question. George Hamill's a huge supporter of the Conservancy. Hi, George and Griffin. So I just, wanted to see if we could fit that one in at least.
That was actually going to be how I thought we could end the evening tonight, because I think it would be interesting for everybody. So you've got a question from Griffin Hamill, and he's saying hi from his dad, George. They both said wonderful talk. They would like to know, what is your favorite discovery from the Eaton site? And I think that's a nice way to wrap up your talk this evening. Do you have one thing that sticks out?
Well, I think it's finding being able to answer some of these questions. Why are there so many points? Why is the one ear off, rather than like an object as such? It's more finding out about what was going on in the past. Thank you.
Thank you. Justin and John, I want to make sure I do see your comments. I will pass them on to Bill and Kelly so that they've seen them also. We appreciate all of you joining us tonight. And thank you to Bill for a wonderful talk. Kelly, thank you for joining us and putting in your 2 cents as well. And Sarah on the back end helping us with the Facebook Live feed. We appreciate all of that. I will be processing things and getting closed captioning onto the video. You should see that email come through from me sometime tomorrow afternoonish. And you're welcome to share our recording with friends and family, or watch it again if you want to. Bill, can I include your email address for anybody who wants to jot you a little note?
Sure.
Fantastic. That's great. So thank you for joining us. Next month, I'm super excited. We are going to have a really interesting presentation for you on a new piece of technology that's being used in looking for paleo evidence. And so we're going to have Brian Fritz here talking about the paleo digger. So please join us for that. You'll see postings on our website and social media about the date. So with that, I would like to say good night to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us.